Nostalgia sells Southern comfort food as an expression of love, family, hospitality. You see it at high-end restaurants, quaint food blogs, a beautiful plated homage to a simpler time. But that's a plantation lie. The math of the American South was not built on love, and it certainly wasn't built on hospitality. It was built on the brutal mathematics of enslavement. See, enslavers knew exactly what they were doing. They were running a capitalist machine. For an enslaved person to generate maximum profits, he had to be fed on the absolute minimal amount of nutrients available. The goal was never to nourish, it was to keep them alive for another day of backbreaking field work. To survive that forced labor in the sweltering southern heat, enslaved women didn't just cook. They engineered, they utilized profound ancestral knowledge brought over from Western Africa to transform useless cornmeal into a high-calorie diet. So join us today while we tell the story of the fufu hiding in the cornmeal. This is One Mic Black History, and if you love stories like this, you can find more stories like this at onemichistory.com. Check out my Substack. Let's get started. To fully understand the journey of fufu, you have to look at the blueprint. Our ancestors didn't arrive to the Americas empty-handed. They were forced into the hulls of slave ships, and they were stripped of their physical possessions, but they couldn't strip them of their history. They arrived with centuries of specialized culinary knowledge. When you look at Western Africa, forget the arbitrary borders and maps drawn up by white colonizers. You have to look at the region by the food that they grew. Western Africa was driven by three distinct agricultural zones: the yam cultures, the rice cultures, and the cereal cultures. Each one of those zones required highly advanced culinary science to keep millions of people alive. Take into account the rice culture from the Windward Coast. African farmers built complex tidal systems to grow native African rice. Those ancestors were forced into the Carolina Low Country, where they created rice as a cash crop and also brought their traditional one-pot rice dishes. That deep history became dishes like Hoppin' John and jambalaya. Then you look at cereal cultures in the savannah. Our ancestors cultivated native grains like millet and sorghum in harsh, dry climates. They meticulously ground and steamed these grains to create dense porridges. That knowledge laid the permanent foundation for southern staples like grits. But today, we're going to focus on the forest regions and the yam culture. See, in Western African regions, starchy staples like yam, cassavas, and plantains were a main source of energy. But there was a catch. See, raw African yams are incredibly tough, and cassavas contain toxic compounds. If you were to eat the roots unprepared, they were way too hard for the body to digest efficiently. So the ancestors broke it down. The genius was never just in the ingredients, it was about the preparation. To unlock the calories, they had to apply physical force. First, they boiled the starchy roots to break down the tough fibers. Then they applied physical pressure. They pounded the boiled vegetables down with wooden mallets and massive mortars. This wasn't light work. It was hours of relentless, rhythmic pounding. This labor-intensive process broke down the plant and transformed a gritty, stubborn root into a smooth, cohesive, high-calorie dough. That dough, that was fufu. Fufu wasn't just a side dish. It was a marvel. It was an energetic foundation that sustained entire African empires. When ancestors were stolen and brought to the Americas, they stepped into a completely different reality. Slavery mandated maximum extraction for minimal overhead. Every dollar spent on feeding enslaved people was not a dollar that was recorded in profits for the captor's ledger. Because of this, standard ration for an enslaved adult was a complete insult. It was just a peck of cornmeal and a few pounds of discarded fatty pork. The captors provided these raw rations because it was the absolute cheapest method to keep the workforce moving. But that raw cornmeal was just a grit. For an enslaved person burning thousands of calories, clearing swamps, and picking cotton, a raw grit was a dead end. If you ate it raw, the body expends more energy trying to digest the grit than it actually gains. The captors didn't care. They prioritized their ledgers over human life. If that dead end led to starvation, disease, and death, that was simply factored into the cost of doing business. But when enslaved women were handed that raw grit, they didn't see a meager ration. They saw an opportunity. They saw a way to keep their families alive by applying the West African blueprint. Yet there was a problem. They couldn't just pound the grits on the plantation because they didn't have the tools. The captors obsessively monitored food preparation, looking for any signs of coordination or rebellion. While a mortar and pestle was a tool of West African culinary practices, more importantly, the rhythmic pounding of the mortar sounds exactly like a drum. To white folks, that drum was a threat. It was loud, it was rhythmic, it was a sign of defiance. It was a tool of communication that could carry messages long distances. Because of that fear, overseers frequently confiscated and banned drums and pounding tools entirely. They wanted total silence and they wanted total dependence. But this is where enslaved women flipped it. They couldn't use a mortar, so they adapted the tradition. They took that raw corn grit and substituted pounding for manual grinding. Using smooth river stones or whatever makeshift heavy tools they could find, they meticulously ground the rations down. This manual, repetitive mimicking of the fufu pounding, it physically broke down the starchy grit to maximize calories. They were making the nutrients accessible to the human body. Once that grit was refined, they moved to the next step of applying hot water directly to the ground meal. This thermal shock and intense heat cooked the grit instantly. It bound the ground corn together to create a cohesive fufu-like dough. They had successfully taken this fufu blueprint and adapted it to that raw corn ration, creating a smooth, calorie-dense dough ball that could easily be shaped by hand. Once that dough ball was formed, it had to be cooked. They couldn't bake it into a soft, delicate loaf. Black women took that cornmeal dough and shaped it by hand into a dense patty. Then they fried it hard. They submerged that dough in heavy grease to create this thick, nearly impenetrable crust. This deep, hard frying was a necessity. It locked out the moisture and the bacteria that caused rapid spoilage in the humid summers. It created an airtight seal around the food. A hard fried piece of hot water cornbread could sit in your pocket for days at a time and remain survival fuel. But the connection to West Africa didn't stop with how it was made. It also lived in how it was eaten. See, back in Western Africa, fufu was never eaten alone. It was broken apart by hand and used to scoop up savory soups and stews. But on a plantation, enslaved people adapted that exact same tradition. They didn't have the rich African stews, but they had nutrient-rich water left over from boiling collard greens and turnip greens. They took that fried hard, hot water cornbread, they broke it apart, and they dipped it right in the collard green juice. They soaked up that broth, using the cornbread exactly how their ancestors had used fufu. That cornbread dough didn't just stay in the boiling grease. It adapted to whatever the brutal environment demanded. If enslaved workers were out in the field in the middle of the day and only had a flat blade or a field hoe, they cooked the dough directly over an open flame and it became a hoe cake. If they had nothing but dying embers of a fire, they wrapped the dough in leaves and buried it in the ashes and it became an ash cake. Over generations, Black folks actually gained access to kitchens and ovens and buttermilk and eggs, and that dense survival ration evolved. It expanded into soft, fluffy, pillowy cornbread that sits on your dinner table today. But no matter how much the recipe changed, the roots of the dish is always left in that fufu, in those African yams and cassavas of Western Africa. See, nostalgia is a comfortable lie. It actively erases the brutality of the plantation. This flowery myth actively erases the West African ingenuity. When you look at the landscape of so-called Southern comfort food, you're not looking at European hospitality, you're looking at stolen Western African genius. That food didn't just sustain life, it kept the West African origins alive under the absolute worst conditions imaginable. Now, next time you sit at a restaurant, next time you order a plate of cornbread, you're not looking at a side dish. You're looking at Black ingenuity on your plate, and you're looking at a little bit of Western Africa and a little bit of fufu in your cornmeal. Thank you. This has been One Mic Black History. I'm your host, Country Boy, and this has been the fufu and the cornmeal. Man, another food episode. This is dope. I really enjoyed this one. I wrote about this a little bit on my Substack. You can go check it out if you want to. Also, I did a video on the complete origins of cornbread. You can go check that one. I'll link those two in the description. But yeah, this has been a dope episode. I want to try to continue to link this. We'll probably do cereal and rice and talk about their origins and that connection, like one pot cooking and jambalaya and things like that. Anyway, I want to thank all my financial contributors. Without you, none of this is possible. You guys are absolutely amazing. I want to thank my day ones, people who supported me from the very beginnings of this channel, because we've been doing this for a while now. And I love you all. I'm so grateful. Peace.